So good morning. I'm delighted to introduce Anjelica Gonzalez. She's led a local seminar in the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute and is currently leading her first national seminar titled Human-Centered Design of Biotechnology. Anjelica serves as an associate professor of biomedical engineering and is also the faculty director of the Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale. She focuses on tissue engineering or regenerative medicine. From seminar, Anjelica's passion to create new technology for people, particularly infants in under-resourced countries, is evident. Reallocating existing technologies and developing highly effective yet low-cost solutions to biomedical problems is what she does best. Anjelica?
Thank you for that introduction, Val. I'm excited to talk to everyone today and tell and share with you a little bit about what we're doing in seminar, and hopefully get you excited about biotech and the potential to use new methods to teach our students about the value of science and engineering. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so, and I encourage you to ask questions in the middle, just shout it out or raise your hand or anything. Again, there's multiple screens, so I'm not gonna be able to see everyone, so just stop me if there are questions. But as Val said, I'm teaching or leading the seminar to these last 2 weeks on human-centered design of biotechnology. And so I thought today I could share a little bit about healthcare interventions and where biotechnology can really benefit from new processes of thinking in the design front. And so I'll start with just a basic definition of biotechnology and what we use in the seminar. And it's really about how technology can interface with humans, with a biological entity. So that can be a bacteria, or how a bacteria can benefit humans. It could be plastics in the environment and knowing what we're doing to the environment that'll ultimately affect humans, and how we can minimize the damage that we're doing to the environment through the use of plastics. We talk a lot about how education can be impactful, and biotechnologies can enhance education and be a means of changing the way students and technology is actually developed. And so there's a broad range of what we define as biotechnology. But briefly, I'll give you a little history of biotechnology and how it's been traditionally described. And the early, even in the BC era, wine, the leavening of bread, brewing of beer, some of my favorite things in the world. I don't think I could do without carbs and alcohol. I would not survive. Those biotechnologies have saved my life in many, many ways. And so really grateful and acknowledging that those were just biological functions of yeast and bacteria that were introduced into natural fruits and flours or processed wheats in order to give the human something of nutritional value that was different from what we had before. And obviously throughout history, these have been improved and increased in their ways of evaluating human biology, microbiology. Things like the microscope developed helped us to be able to see and get a true identification of different kinds of biological structures. Clearly, vaccination, the smallpox vaccine created by Edward Jenner, pasteurization, a way that we actually change how we do vaccinations beyond what it meant for pasteurization or safety of food, have all been biotechnologies that affected our lives. And finally, we get to these things that are much more kind of complex. So identifying the DNA structure, the helical structure of DNA, in order to then have an idea of how to create recombinant or splicing of DNA for genetic engineering. So much of that is based on the basic foundation of understanding science and manipulating science or scientific discovery in order to create a technology that's going to impact humans. And the advances continue and continue. So all the way from bread and wine, we come to new vaccines, antiretroviral viral drugs and therapies, diagnostics and therapeutics for chronic diseases like heart disease. We've all heard about genomics and proteomics in the last few years as high-tech modifications of, understanding of our human genome. and potential for modifications and identification of points where we would kind of eliminate disease from our children, from ourselves. Stem cell and organ therapies are rapidly increasing, again, high-tech biotechnology. And then we also know that with regards to agriculture, genetically modified crops, to make sure that these crops aren't susceptible to some kind of disease or mosquitoes or some kind of detrimental animal or insect, is a way of applying biotechnology to a system that's going to affect humans. And finally, we just covered this in seminar, thinking about mental health as a way that biotechnologies can be improved and used to make sure that we are appropriately diagnosing, maybe intervening when people are in crisis, or even when they're experiencing moderate levels of mental health issues. So there's a wide landscape of what we can do with biotechnology development. And while we still have advanced biotechnology from the BC era, continually advancing, there are still so many things left to solve, so many problems left to solve with regards to diseases and disorders. Those are new pathogens and organisms that pop up every year. So we clearly had a firsthand experience with so much of that in the last 2 years. There's also this emergence and reemergence constantly of antibiotic resistant microbes that that mean we're going to have to figure out new ways to attack some of the same old microbes that we've been using and we've been seeing for decades. As I mentioned, the use of plastics, climate change, and so many other aspects of the way we're living is influencing the world around us. And so we really need to be considerate of how biotechnology might serve as a means of intervention. But then there are things that we haven't really considered means of biotechnology disruption or intervention in things like war, social disruption or unrest, natural disasters. And those are things where biotechnology is meant to intervene after the fact. There's not too much we can do to control natural disaster or civil unrest, but we probably want to start thinking a lot about how we can develop biotechnology that is mobile, that can be carried out to fields that don't have water or electricity, so that we can address the injuries that our soldiers or that the civilians are experiencing during these times. And finally, part of this is all about economics. Are we able to afford the biotechnology that are going to save our lives? And do we believe that health and survival is a human right, thereby making biotechnology, life-saving biotechnologies, accessible to everyone, regardless of where they are, what their economic status is? Can we do that? And so these are the problems that we discussed in seminar, and some means by which we want to solve them. So I'm an engineer, and my job is really to solve problems. But what we've done traditionally is thought about these problems kind of in a linear fashion, and pretty much in the way we've done engineering, especially in the medical field, is that what do we have that already works, and let's just throw what works at the problem. And what that resulted in is these medical technology graveyards around the world. Obviously, this is not where we want to see our devices, our medical technology end up, because this is not saving anyone's life. It's not doing any good for anyone. In fact, it's probably doing more harm than good, both to the trust of humans on the receiving end around technology. If you say, I have an incubator, but no baby is saved by the use of this incubator, then that leads to a distrust of the human for the technology. But it also is more plastic, more metal, more waste generally that's not going to do any good for our planet. And so the reason that we teach now a new method of thinking about interventions into healthcare, the healthcare space, is because we've learned that if we have a different mindset, what we call the design thinking mindset, it allows us to play a little bit more with the multiple inputs, the context around the technology itself. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we reframe the problem, we reframe the space to begin with. What I mean by that is we might say, oh yes, in the US, incubators have worked exceptionally well to keep infant survival rates low, or infant survival rates high, mortality rates low. And so we'll just toss those to every country who needs them. But in fact, that means that we haven't really looked at the problem in the local environment, where, again, electricity might not be available, where clean water might not be available, where the incubator is not a suitable means in the way that we've developed it in the US. So really reframing the problem, that it's not just the need for incubator, but it's an incubator that does not need an electrical grid to operate. And so in order to do that, to reframe that picture, that means we have to collaborate. We have to collaborate in ways that we've not done before. And really, when we talk about radical collaboration, that means collaborating much more closely with the end user. Maybe the parents who are putting their babies in the incubators, maybe the nurses who are working on those, maybe local mechanics who would repair those incubators when they fail. So really thinking more broadly about the design space and the people who are involved in the design space than we typically have done. What this also means is that we have to have an inherent curiosity about not just the problem that we think we're going to solve, but also the context around it. What kind of cultures are we going to engage with when we move our technology into a new space? What kind of policy should we be thinking about beforehand or even after the point of development? Should we be thinking about costs and affordabilities at the beginning of our technology development? So it really means having a curiosity about the space all around us and not coming in with a previously formed idea that, oh, I have the solution because I did this in New Haven, Connecticut, so it's definitely going to work in Wisconsin, because that's not the case. The next step and the key to this mindset, I think, is that we understand that we want to have action. We have a bias towards action. Too many times, even we see it in our classes, even our students, they get to the point where they're like, okay, I have a great idea. And that's where it ends. The idea isn't put out into the world in any form, not even a picture or a prototype, which can be so simple. So when you have a design thinking mindset, it's a bias towards action, getting something, even the smallest momentum, into your idea, behind your idea. And finally, it means there has to be a process. A process helps people move through multiple steps in order to see how they can push their ideas forward and test their ideas. And so understanding that there's a process in order to really get behind the action that's part of the design thinking mindset becomes important. So what does a process look like? Well, a process in this case is really a 5-step program. And so those who have been in the seminar with me already have seen this and have even done it. We did a design thinking workshop in our first meeting together. So they didn't know me and didn't know how crazy I could be. I had to just throw this at them on the first day. But really what it does is it gives you the opportunity not to think so hard about what you can't do, what the barriers to creation. So many students come to me and say, well, I'm not an engineer. I don't know how to do this. Well, let's just try and see what happens. And if we fail, we just start over and try again. Or we come up with a new idea. And that's really what the design thinking process is about. First, focusing on the question by asking the curious questions of the people who are going to be those who use your device, who use your biotechnology, really engaging the end user in order to make sure you're addressing a problem with a solution that's going to be relevant to them. You then go through the defining phase where you really develop a problem statement to clearly articulate the problem that you're aiming to solve. And once we have articulated that, we can start to brainstorm. And really, unlimited optimistic brainstorming is the key to a really creative solution. But you can't do that alone. To be creative, we have to step out of our normal conversations. And that means going back to that idea of the radical collaboration, going to talk to people we wouldn't have talked to otherwise, people who have different political views, different approaches to solutions, different aspects of the technology that we're approaching in order to make sure that we have a more encompassed view of the opportunities. And finally, as I said, bias towards action. And that means a rough and ready, down and dirty prototype. Getting something out in the world, not just so you feel like you accomplished something, but to actually be tested. So you go and you give that to somebody and say, hey, I just drew this thing, or I just made something out of tape and pipe cleaners and a toilet paper roll. This is my idea. What do you think? And that's the only way to really start the iterative process of developing something, putting it out of the world, making sure it meets the needs of the end user, and then creating prototype number 2. And making it better and better towards the solution every time. And that's really a pretty simple idea behind innovation of technology specifically. And so how this turns our typical research and engineering programs on its head is that it's human-centered. For decades and decades, we've left the human, the user, out of the design process. So as I said, we'll typically develop something in the lab and say, oh, this functionally does what I said it was going to do. Now you take it and you use it and you tell me how great I am. But that's not realistic, because if we don't get somebody who actually wants to use it, can afford to use it, can access it, then it's not going to be the technology that we developed. And so those first three steps, empathizing, defining, and ideating, mean that we need to understand clearly the human need and the human context into which we'll put our devices or our biotechnology or our systems development in the end. And that becomes extremely important. But those last two are also human-centered in their development in those parts of the processes. Because what we're looking for is not just consumerism. We don't want somebody to just buy our device and then, again, I do want somebody to tell me how great I am, but I want my device to be used. That's more important. And so to do that, we have to include the end user. We have to include other people in our development so that they're now participants and not just consumers. And that's why prototyping and testing, getting feedback constantly and iteratively becomes extremely important. And in the end, what you hope you have is a product, a system, an educational platform that's desirable, something that the human wanted, that's feasible, something that the human can actually use and hold in their hand, and that's viable, something that can be sustainable or survive and be affordable and accessed by those humans. And so this is really, the basis of our ideas of human-centered design in the design thinking process for biotechnology development. Are there any questions? I'm going to scan really quickly just to make sure I'm not missing anybody's hand or anything like that. All right, I don't see anything, but like I said, feel free to interrupt. Okay, so what does this mean in the health space? So you can imagine that Apple probably does a lot of this design thinking, right? Where they ask for feedback and they ask you for beta testing and really human interface with their devices. And that does happen. So why did it take so long for us to think about this in the biotechnology space and the development of technologies for healthcare? Well, that's probably because, again, we think of the human as a system that doesn't have a true response other than a biological outcome, either breathing or circulatory function, that the heart's beating. So the outcomes that we've always thought about have been pretty static. But we're starting to integrate this idea that even if I tell you, please take your medicine, you're not going to take it if it does something that you don't like. You're not going to take it if it's too expensive. You're not going to take it if it's too hard to get to. There's a lot of decision-making, cognitive function that has to happen, and familiarity with the technology that has to happen in order for you to decide to do so. And so what that means is within the healthcare space, there's a lot of room for us to apply this design thinking for biotechnology development. And this can be in the development of devices. So devices as we know them, so a pen is a device. We can think about devices that are in the hospital, so a heart rate monitor, all of those types of things. This could be modification of a physical environment. Can we make an environment more pleasurable so that people actually want to come there? Can we make an environment more private so that people can feel comfortable having discussions about their health and their healthcare status? Is this about education? Could we build better technologies within education or better means of telling people or explaining to people how to use technologies, or use technology itself as an educational tool in the healthcare system? And finally, systems. We can also look at systems as complex objects that are built of parts that are created from within the healthcare structure. So I'm going to give a few examples of each of these. But the premise of this means that we have to have identified a problem. So when I'm describing these, I'm going to describe them in problem statement form. And a problem statement looks like this in its simplest form. How might we help blank to do blank? Right? So this may be, how might I help Valerie to knock out her amazing curricular unit, right? So something that's pretty specific, but also you'll notice we have somebody in that space, a human, a group of human that we're solving the problem for. And that again is part of that define step in the process. So we'll go to first devices and technology. It's the simplest thing that comes to mind because they're tangible items. They're things that we always already associate with biotechnology. And it can be simple or complex. And the reason I like to talk about them as simple or complex is because most people think it's got to be like this. You have to have a PhD in engineering. You have to have some basic science, a higher level education in order to do this. But really, we have low-tech devices that have made meaningful changes in people's health and their lifestyle. So it doesn't always have to be genetic engineering in order to be a meaningful advance in people's health or a meaningful health intervention. One example of that is a simple technology that was developed by a mother. It's a toothbrush that she developed at home because she saw that her child had difficulty in getting his teeth cleaned using a traditional toothbrush. His motor functions weren't as good as an adult for whom the toothbrush was designed. And so if you look at this, it has multiple brushes, each at a 45-degree angle to the center brush, and it allows the child to then capture the tooth and then scrub the front and the back of the tooth without as much difficulty as he would if he'd had to rotate the brush. This was a mother. No advanced education, no advanced scientific education, and not an engineer. But I would argue that's a pretty amazing health intervention. And she developed this primarily because she observed that the human, of whom she was very curious, was having issues around toothbrushing. She used what she could find and already knew about toothbrushing. She understood the goal and the problem that she wanted to solve. And she rough and ready prototyped this. Within a year's time of the initial prototype, she was able to get a patent and began manufacturing these devices. And you can find them on Amazon as well. So this is one of my favorite stories about a person, just any person who was able to use this idea without advanced training in order to get something done and innovate on healthcare technologies. And it can be very complex, right? Complex using simple systems. So another example is detecting proteins from the urine of pregnant women that would allow them to diagnose themselves or be diagnosed with preeclampsia. And what is very difficult about this is that in the US, we use very complex technology, multiple vital sign metrics in order to diagnose a person. But really, there's a protein in the urine that if you could just identify that, you know that you are preeclamptic or on the verge of it. And so one scientist used a paper-based technology. So this is just paper, just regular printer paper that has wicking technology. So all it does, that just soaks up the urine, and the protein within the paper turns red when it sees another kind of protein. And so really simple technology that almost anybody could use for diagnostics of preeclampsia. So while the science behind it is complex, the technology itself is quite simple. And so we can think again about devices and technology in that way and see how these kind of processes of understanding what's happening in the context of the environment can help us to develop something that's pretty cool. So the physical environment I mentioned is another place where we can innovate, and specifically using the design thinking about the human's experience in this space to create a biotechnology that's going to be more impactful. The simple question here is, how might we organize a storefront to ensure privacy for needle exchange? So needle exchange is a common practice across the United States. We want to make sure that people who are IV drug users are not using dirty needles and increasing their risk of HIV, hepatitis, or any of the number of additional diseases that come with the use of needles. And so here in New Haven, there was developed a needle exchange program that was not getting good traction. They put it in the center of the area where they knew there was good traffic for these kind of activities, but the store front itself was not getting good traction. And it was primarily because people would say, if I go into this building, people know what I'm doing. And I can't risk my family, I can't risk my employer, I can't risk my gossipy neighbor talking to everybody about my business, particularly around this issue. And so the innovation here was that they found a way to make the storefront less conspicuous. You could go and access it through a restaurant in the next door, or through the dry cleaner next door. And the exchange was actually very private. So disguising the storefront and figuring out access points to make sure that people had the privacy necessary to have a functional needle exchange became the innovation there. It could be really complex. The other aspect that we've experienced lately is airborne transmission of diseases. And we know even before COVID that airborne transmission was happening more readily in hospitals. People get sicker in hospitals than they get anywhere else. And in New Delhi, where there's poor air circulation, not air-conditioned hospitals, waiting rooms, poor electricity, one of the students that was in my class a few years ago developed a method to, into the paint that is used for the walls, to put a microbial killing nanoparticle. By putting it into the paint, what that meant is that as people were breathing, you were able to capture the particulates, kill the bacteria, and make it no longer harmful in the environment, reducing the airborne transmission of disease. And so that's a bit more complex. Nanoparticles, paint, and protocols for making sure that the walls remain exposed for the paint to work. And not as simple, but we can see that physical environment modifications through biotechnology can also be really impactful. So education and training. This is a really interesting thing because even simple technologies can be really impactful. I spoke with my seminar colleagues at the beginning of this year about a story in which we've come to understand that some of the people who are most resistant to washing their hands are those who we need to wash their hands the most, and those would be physicians. Physicians are traditionally not, they're too busy. You know, their excuse is, oh, I've got to run to this patient, I've got to run to this patient. And without washing hands in between patients, what is the expectation? We know we're going to spread disease, and that's what happens. And when you just tell them, okay, wash your hands, and ask them, have you washed your hands? Then they will self-report much higher rates of hand washing than is actually happening. And so Cedars-Sinai actually monitored hand washing, and at different points of the year, it became as low as 15% of physicians were washing their hands in between visits with patients. Yeah, I see Taryn's look. She's kind of grossed out as I was when I saw this data. And so what that means is that just telling somebody something doesn't mean it's enough, right? If we really want to see change, if we really want to see education enacted, the knowledge enacted to be meaningful, then we have to do something. And one of the things to do is to put up signs and have frequent reminders, and also monitoring technologies. So beyond these signs that would be put up, there would also be individuals who would use an app, and they would monitor and detail when they saw a physician not washing their hands between interactions. That also tailored into grand rounds the next morning and staff meetings when the physicians would be shamed and their names would be called out if their hand washing was not up to par with the standards that the hospital had dictated. And what do we see? We see an increase by 85%, almost 100% of the physicians then were conforming with the regulations about hand washing. So we can use technology in fairly simple ways in order to make sure that education is spread and that the education that we're giving people is actually useful for the outcomes that we want to see. The other kinds of technologies that might be a little bit more complex would be those that help us think about how might we would develop a universal protocol for reporting of vital measures. We need to teach people or give people technology to make these things much, much more simple. They're very difficult, inconsistent across hospital systems, across hospitals, and definitely globally. So figuring out ways, whether it's a teaching platform or literature, something that enables the much more standard methods of data collection for these issues becomes very important. And finally, systems. Systems are a bit more difficult to think about because in and of themselves, they're really complex. But we can take apart these systems to think about who we're working with, what their goal is, and how they might enact improvements, use technology to improve. So one of these, the simple opportunity is thinking about how might we improve the efficiency of community healthcare worker operations. So throughout the US, but even more often in countries that are underserved by healthcare systems, so with low hospitals, clinic availability, or distant clinics, healthcare workers become the primary source of care for the people in a community. And what this means is that those healthcare workers have to be trained. They have to go to individuals' homes. They have to provide medicines or diagnostics or prophylactics for whatever's happening in that area. But when studies were done, what they observed was the limiting factor was getting those people to all the places they needed to be. And that's because they would take bikes where there was low vehicle usage. They would take bicycles, but the bicycles would often have either flat tires, chains that would get broken because of overuse, were not well lubricated. So systems that would support frequent maintenance of these transportation devices became extremely helpful in making this a much more efficient system for healthcare services in countries that were in places that were remote and based on community healthcare worker access. And so, we think, oh, that can't make that much of a difference. But just getting to a person's home in order to give them their insulin or their packages of insulin or accessing their vaccines, while we might not think about it here, because we know in different environments, different people have different systems, we really have to pay attention to the context. Again, making design thinking key in this in these systems. And finally, much more complex, how might we improve the healthcare access in the aging population? What this means is that we are seeing many more complex chronic diseases than we were previously of infectious diseases. So we really want to think about systems that are going to help prepare people for facing chronic diseases. And that could mean, education, multiple points in the system, the healthcare system, that would allow us to address a specific population, in this case, aging population. So I've run through at least 5 now different types of technologies that have been focused on the idea that understanding the human context and the human experience in the hospital setting, at home when doing dental care. Observing those interactions really matters in how we develop a technology to make the outcomes even better. Because without those technologies that are more human-centered in their design, we don't have the positive outcomes. So you might be thinking, well, what does this mean for the National Teachers Institute? None of us are going to be developing healthcare systems. But what I'll tell you is that the fellows in the seminar have done an amazing job we're halfway through and have already outlined some amazing opportunities to, one, have students have more autonomy over their experience in the classroom. And that's through student-driven application-based problem solving, which is really what design thinking is about. The other spaces that they have played in is thinking about how can we teach students processes that allow them to get very interested in designing and engineering. And what I'm most impressed by is that this, as a whole, gives students the opportunity to see themselves in science. Too often we say, oh, you have to be at Yale, you have to be at Penn, you have to be, somewhere fancy in order to be a scientist or an engineer who's going to make a difference. But I told you, there was a mother who saw a problem in her child's ability to brush his teeth. She was not at Yale, she was not at Penn. She was a mother at home who saw a problem in a human and wanted to help that human. And we can teach our students at any level. I try to do it with college students. They're more resistant to me, so I think you'll have better luck. But you can teach them that they can do these things because it's just a mindset, and it's all about access and getting it done, using your experience to get it done. So I wanted to share some of the ideas that the fellows in the seminar are thinking about. Christiana, Leslie, and Irene are all thinking about how do we access the information that's out there in the world. So through the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank, through the CDC, how do we take that information and have our students mine that information in order to apply it to mathematical concepts, graphical analysis, and also integrate public health concepts with that information. Jesse is doing some amazing work in STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and biotechnology, figuring out how to translate again to the students that any mindset, an artist's mindset can be contributory to design and engineering. Chelsea, Michael, and Ty are all thinking about ways in which we can think about environmental science, populations, and the interventions from technology in helping to regulate climate change, in helping to give students ideas about farming and vertical farming, so access to healthy foods, and also thinking about what this means for populations as they grow. Or could it mean that populations are going to shrink and we're going to need different technologies to support those populations? Michelle is thinking about the broadly beneficial and appropriate technologies. She's calling this the curb effect. And it's really fascinating because the way she introduces her students to this concept is that when a sidewalk curb was first developed, and that's that dip in the sidewalk at the corner, it was meant particularly for access for wheelchairs. But we all use this, right? When I've done too many squats, I can't take the big step off the curb. I have to use the slope. Bikes use it, skateboarders use it. We all use it. We use it to get our shopping cart out into the parking lot, right? We all have used it. So there are amazing technologies, technological developments that we all can benefit from. And we might not know how to design them. But by thinking ahead of time about the impact of our technologies, we could do a much more broadly beneficial and appropriate technology design. Valerie has a really great project that she's thinking about, or curriculum that she's developing, specifically about bees. But what it really is, that she's not calling it, is about engineering and modeling an ecosystem. These students are doing coding. They're understanding how bee pollination, the value of bees, the danger to bees, from what we as humans are doing to the ecosystem, and the role of bees in the ecosystem, and actually help having them build this out to understand the impact globally. And finally, I have to say, Charlotte, it's one of my favorite. She's talking about harnessing the power of failure. Now, what is exciting about this is that we don't talk about failure generally. And I'll promise you, when I say the word failure in my Yale classes, my students cry. They want to run out of the room and they don't want to see me again. But really, when I told you that process of design thinking is iterative, it means you have to acknowledge and digest the failure that the person who you designed this for, they might not like it. They might not want to use it. It may not have worked appropriately. And so what that means is we have to understand and dissect that failure and see it as a win, because it'll only make our whole system better. It'll make our outcomes better. And really, the days that I fail in class, I think I failed a couple of days ago when we were doing the demography. And the days I fail are the days I also learn. I learn, what works, what doesn't work, how to do it better next time. And if I'm invited back to do it again next time, I'll be all the better. So really thinking about failure and the power behind failure. So I'm going to leave it there. We have about 15 minutes, I think, left, but I'm open to questions, thoughts, ways to transition this idea of design thinking into different forms, anything you want to talk about.
I have a question. How do we get that paint for our classrooms, not just because of COVID, but because of all the flu? And is it like cost prohibitive that schools aren't using it, or just not known, or
It's in, that very interesting question, very good question. So one of the things about anything that's going into a hospital, it needs to have validation by FDA. So we've talked about FDA approval processes, but because it's going to impact the human health, we want to make sure that it's doing what it says it's going to do and reduces airborne infection. So ultimately, yes, it will be available, but right now it's still in clinical phase. Chris, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for a great presentation here. I'm very excited by design thinking, but I have two connected idea questions here. So one of the great ideas behind design thinking this way, I think, is how we start with this idea of empathy. But I think very, very often we think in culture right now, there's kind of an empathy deficit. Maybe not with children or people we're teaching, but I do feel it's something we have to account for. So I was curious about your thoughts on that. And then the other end of this is empathy and capitalism usually do not match up. And at the end of the day, when we're making a product, it does not always have to be a capitalistic venture, but it can be. So how do we kind of bridge this gap here, potentially with students and those who we're teaching?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So both fascinating questions. I get very excited by this first question because I don't know the answer to it. And so I'm always looking for more literature on this. What you're really asking is, can empathy be taught? Right? Can we, for those who do not have empathy inherently or just not making those connections, can we teach them to do it? Well, empathy implies that you have a feeling about it too. And I think that's where we get into a problem. You can't make someone have a feeling. You can't force that to happen if it's not going to happen inherently. What we can ask of students is to consider the effects. And if we have them consider the effects of an action, of an interaction with the technology, of a particular color or a design, if we can have them consider effects, that might be as close as we can get to teaching empathy, is have them to understand effects. And, I've read Brene Brown's books on, she believes that you can teach empathy, but that very much more through, understanding shame and guilt and all of these things around feelings. But when we're working with students, I have not gotten to the point where I feel like I can make them feel something that they don't. And so that's where I think I would disagree that we can teach empathy, but we can teach people how to understand the effect of their actions, understand the effects of our technology development and the interactions. Now, the second part of your question is this idea about commercialization and social impact, that sometimes they don't go hand in hand. And I would say that is very true. We'll talk about that more in seminar. And one of the things that we want to acknowledge is that now consumers have a lot of choices, even with healthcare. Consumers have choices. And we will tend now, the more informed consumer, to buy something from someone who makes us feel good or helps us feel like we're making the right choice for the community, for the world, not just for ourselves. And so social responsibility becomes a big part of money making, which is why groups like Johnson & Johnson and other, really big companies invest in helping global outcomes, why they donate machines to other countries. They're not making money off of this, but they want you to know that they're helping the world so that you'll give them your money when the time comes. So there's this balance that happens with the public perception of doing good for the world. The other thing is that there is an emerging interest in social entrepreneurship. This acknowledgement, like you said, that doing good for the world can actually bring you money in the US market. And when we develop technologies, for example, the company that I own is called Aerotherapeutics, and we developed a device that is for babies to breathe, but specifically developed for babies in low resource settings who don't have access to electricity or clean water, when the physicians don't have access to those things. However, what we've come to understand is there's a US market for that too. Southern states have issues with access to clean water and electricity. There are rural communities who have those issues. The cost of the current devices are prohibitive. And so having developed something with only a social impact goal now means that we have interest from other companies who want to pivot our product into the US. So really what that is saying to us, and many of the students who are interested in social entrepreneurship, is that having an impact in one area may open up markets that are broader, which means ultimately more money and more success for your company or your commercial goals. So you're absolutely right. I think times are changing though, in that the view of the consumer as somebody who has a choice has made a huge difference in the ideas behind social impact and social entrepreneurship.
Thank you.
Yeah, hope that helps. I'm going to scroll around and see if I see any other hands. If not, just shout out your question.
I had a question. First of all, thank you so much for your talk this morning. I think that we could all benefit from having that outlook with our students that failure can be an exciting thing, or not knowing can be an open door. And I think that that's something we can all take into our classroom. So thank you. As far as things like healthcare, and I was thinking about it with the hand washing piece, because obviously that was really gross, but obviously it's something that we should be thinking about with our students this year, because our students are obviously going to have to be in a new environment this year, right? They're going to have to be wearing masks. Some of us have already been in the classroom with them, but many of us are just kind of going to be branching out to this venture. So I was kind of looking to pick your brain about ways, especially for younger students, in grades like K5 or K8, how we can use that opportunity of what's going on in our world right now to have meaningful conversations with them and do engineering type projects, as many of us are trying to push into our classrooms around that kind of topic, and have them thinking about those things and how they can impact their own world.
So, so first thing I would say, with the reason shaming works with physicians is that they already think they're way up here, right? So we're just bringing them down to the reality that they need to do the same things that everybody else is doing. I don't advise that for a kindergartner. We don't want to shame our kids, right? Right. So it's about understanding the context and who you're dealing with. But that is, hand washing is a great opportunity for students to, one, understand the reasons. Why do we wash our hands? Because we need to get all the microbes, all the, virus, all the particulates off of our hands. And you can present the problem of, well, I don't like it. And so I don't do it enough. And I think some of us don't do it enough. So how might we together build a system that helps us to wash our hands more frequently, because that's really the problem. And I can imagine what is always so shocking to me is students at every level. I've done this with a kindergarten class. I've done this with obviously college students, and now with my very young seminar fellows. The solutions that they come up with for any problem are things I would have never thought of. I would not have thought to approach it in the same way, whether it's scheduling and timing, or the actual, how can multiple people be at the sink at the same time? All of those kind of ideas, things I would not have thought of, students or other people will, because their perspective on the problem is very different. So even something small but largely impactful and something you really want to have in the classroom can give students a sense, again, of autonomy over their day and over a change that they will see an outcome for. And so you could use those same steps. Okay, have them identify what the real problem is. Is it that they don't want to get out of their seat? Is it they don't know how often they're supposed to? What is the problem that's prohibitory to the outcome that you're looking for, and have them break it down in that way. That it might be helpful, and it might be fun, right? Thinking, again, this is more about a mindset that we can approach any problem, almost any problem, and specifically around healthcare technologies, with the human understanding better why it's not working for the human in the first place.
Thank you.